The letter in my hands was shaking, not from the wind cutting across the reformatory parking lot, but from my own trembling fingers as I read the words that would change everything. Mr. Ryan King, you are hereby notified that you have inherited the Blackwood Ranch property in Pine Ridge, Montana, from your late great-uncle, Dennis Ward. I was 20 years old, had just walked out of my final meeting with my caseworker, and suddenly I owned land I'd never heard of from a family member I never knew existed. Standing there with my single duffel bag and $200 in cash, I felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. The lawyer's letter explained that Dennis Ward had been searching for family before he died 6 months ago and somehow found me through the state system. The ranch had been in our family for 3 generations, and now it was mine. All mine. The only catch was I had to claim it in person within 30 days, or it would be sold to pay back taxes. I'd spent the last 4 years at Millbrook Reformatory after aging out of foster care with nowhere else to go. Some kids called it prison, but for me it had been stability. 3 meals a day, a bed that was mine, and programs that taught me everything from auto mechanics to basic accounting. Now I was free, but free felt terrifying when you had no idea where to go next. This letter felt like a lifeline thrown from a ghost. The bus ride to Pine Ridge took 18 hours and cost me $60 I couldn't afford to spend. But something deep in my chest pulled me west, past cities and suburbs, through farmland, and finally into mountain country I'd only seen in pictures. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. Because what happened next changed not just where I lived, but who I was. I'd grown up knowing almost nothing about my family. My mother died when I was 7, and I never knew my father. The social workers said there were no relatives willing to take me, so I bounced between foster homes until I was 16, when I made some bad choices that landed me in the system. 4 years of structure and therapy had straightened me out, but I still carried that hollow feeling of being completely alone in the world. The letter from the law firm of Miller & Associates had arrived 3 days before my release. Helen Wood, my caseworker, had handed it to me with raised eyebrows. Quote 1. I'd shaken my head, but even then something stirred in the back of my memory. A song my mother used to hum, something about mountains and wide open spaces. Maybe she'd known about this place. Pine Ridge turned out to be the kind of small town where the main street was actually called Main Street, and it looked like it hadn't changed much since 1950. The bus dropped me at a gas station that doubled as the town's transportation hub, and I stood there with my duffel bag, breathing air so clean it almost hurt my lungs. Mountains rose up on all sides, covered in pine trees that gave the town its name, and everything felt bigger and quieter than anywhere I'd ever been. The law office was easy to find, mostly because there were only about 6 businesses on the main strip. Eric Miller, the lawyer handling Dennis Ward's estate, was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. His office smelled like coffee and old leather, and the walls were covered with photos of local ranches and farmland. Quote Tushum, he said, settling behind his desk with a thick file folder. Shodashana quote Trinoan. I told him honestly. Quote 5. Eric nodded and opened the folder, pulling out several documents and an old photograph. Quote Santamo. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and eyes that looked familiar when I stared into the mirror. She was standing in front of a log cabin with mountains in the background, smiling at whoever was taking the picture. Seeing her face was like finding a piece of myself I never knew was missing. Eric continued, I studied the legal documents, trying to make sense of property descriptions and tax information. Quote, honest, Eric said. Quote 11. My head spun. I'd never owned anything more valuable than a used bicycle, and suddenly I was responsible for land worth more money than I could imagine. What if I can't pay the taxes? Dennis set aside some money for that, Eric assured me, enough to get you through the first year if you're careful. After that, well, you'll need to figure out how to make the ranch profitable again. He handed me a set of keys and a hand-drawn map. The ranch is about 8 miles outside town. Dennis left you a truck too. It's old, but it runs. There's also this. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in shaky handwriting. He wanted you to read this when you got there. The truck was a 1995 Ford pickup with rust around the wheel wells and a passenger door that stuck, but it started on the first try. Driving those 8 miles on winding mountain roads, I felt like I was traveling not just through space, but through time, leaving behind everything I'd known and heading into a completely unknown future. The ranch appeared around a curve in the road, like something out of a movie. The main house was a two-story log structure with a wraparound porch and green metal roof. It sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with cattle, with the mountains rising up beyond like protective walls. A red barn stood to one side, along with several smaller buildings I couldn't identify. Everything looked weathered but solid, like it had been built to last forever. I parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a long moment, just staring. This was mine, all of it. The concept felt too big to fit inside my head. I'd spent my whole life in institutions and temporary places, never owning anything permanent, never having a space that truly belonged to me. Now I was looking at more land than I could walk across in a day, and it all had my name on the deed. The front door was unlocked, which seemed impossible to someone who'd grown up in the city, but Eric had mentioned that people didn't lock their doors much in Pine Ridge. The inside of the house was dark and smelled like wood smoke, and something else I couldn't identify, something that might have been loneliness. Heavy furniture filled the rooms, and every wall was covered with photographs of the ranch through different seasons, different decades. I found the kitchen and opened the envelope Dennis Ward had left for me. His handwriting was difficult to read, shaky with age or illness, but his words hit me like a physical force. Ryan, if you're reading this, then you came, and that means more to me than you'll ever know. I spent my whole life on this land, and I couldn't bear the thought of it being sold to strangers who would tear down everything my father and grandfather built. Your grandmother Sarah was my baby sister, and I loved her dearly. When she left Montana, she broke our parents' hearts, but I never stopped hoping she'd come home someday. She never did, but maybe you will. The letter went on to explain the basics of ranch operations, where to find important documents, and which neighbors I could trust for help. But it was the ending that made my throat tight with emotions I didn't know how to name. I spent my first night in the ranch house lying awake on a couch that was probably older than I was, listening to sounds I'd never heard before. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from neighboring rooms, just wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, and the settling sounds of an old house. It should have been peaceful, but the silence felt enormous, almost overwhelming. The next morning I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. The house was bigger than any place I'd ever lived, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen large enough to feed a family of 10. But it was also empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. This had been the home of a lonely old man who'd spent his final years hoping for family that never came. I made coffee with grounds I found in the freezer and explored the outbuildings. The barn was solid but needed repairs, with stalls for horses that weren't there anymore and storage areas filled with equipment I didn't recognize. A smaller building turned out to be a workshop with tools that looked like they'd been maintained with the kind of care that comes from a lifetime of use. The cattle were scattered across the nearest pasture, and they watched me with the patient curiosity of animals who'd seen generations of humans come and go. I'd never been around livestock before, but something about their presence felt right, like they belonged to the landscape in a way that made the whole place feel more real. By noon, I'd worked up the courage to drive back into Pine Ridge. I needed groceries, but more than that, I needed to start figuring out how to live in this place. The town felt different in daylight, less like a movie set and more like a real community where people had been building lives for generations. At the general store, I met Martha Long, a woman in her 60s who seemed to know everything about everyone in Pine Ridge. When I introduced myself as Ryan King, her eyes widened with recognition. "Quote 19," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Lord have mercy, you look just like your grandmother did when she was your age. Sarah Ward was the prettiest girl in 3 counties before she ran off to California." "You knew my grandmother." "Honey, I was 2 grades behind her in school. She was homecoming queen and valedictorian, could have had any boy in the valley, but she had her sights set on bigger things than Pine Ridge could offer." Martha's expression softened. Quote 23. I bought basic supplies and listened to Martha's stories about my grandmother, hungry for any details about the family I'd never known. Sarah had been smart and ambitious, determined to see the world beyond the mountains. She'd gotten a scholarship to college in California and never looked back. Martha didn't know what had happened to her after that, but she remembered Dennis getting a letter about 20 years ago saying Sarah had died, leaving behind a daughter. Quote 24. Martha said gently. Quote to 25. That afternoon, I drove to the neighboring ranch, following directions Martha had given me. The Morris spread was 3 times the size of mine, with newer buildings and cattle that looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Noah Morris met me at his front gate, a man in his 40s with sun-weathered hands and eyes that seemed to take my measure in a single glance. "So you're Dennis's boy," he said, and there was something in his tone I couldn't quite read. I corrected. Noah nodded slowly. Quote 30. I shook my head. Quote 31. Quote 30. Noah's expression wasn't unkind, but it wasn't particularly welcoming either. That ranch needs about $50,000 worth of work just to be functional again. You got that kind of money? I'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. Noah studied me for a long moment. Tell you what, I've got a fence line that borders your north pasture, and it's been down for 6 months. If you want to help me fix it, I'll teach you a few things about ranching. Consider it a neighborly gesture. The next morning, I met Noah at sunrise, and he handed me work gloves and a post hole digger. For the next 8 hours, we worked under the Montana sun, replacing fence posts and stringing wire. My hands blistered despite the gloves, my back ached, and sweat soaked through my shirt. But something about the physical labor felt right in a way that sitting in classrooms never had. Noah didn't talk much while we worked, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. He told me about soil conditions and grass rotation, about reading weather signs and recognizing when cattle were sick. He explained the economics of ranching, how thin the profit margins were, and how quickly things could go wrong. Quote 36, Noah said as we took a water break in the shade of his truck. Quote 37, quote Watu, quotes, or knew Noah looked at me carefully. Quote Watum. I didn't have an answer, but something in Noah's tone suggested this was more than casual conversation. Quote Shanish, quote around. Noah's voice carried a note of disgust. He's made offers to half the ranchers around here, and some of them are tempted. Ranching's a hard life, and it's getting harder. That evening, I sat on Dennis Ward's front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains and thinking about Noah's words. The beauty of this place was undeniable, but I was starting to understand the challenge I'd inherited. This wasn't just land, it was a way of life that required knowledge, skill, and resources I didn't have. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm of learning and working. I spent mornings reading ranching guides Dennis had left in his study, trying to understand everything from cattle nutrition to hay production. Afternoons were for hands-on work, fixing fence, cleaning out water troughs, and slowly getting to know the 40 head of cattle that were now my responsibility. The cattle had been neglected, not abused, but not properly cared for either. Several needed medical attention I couldn't afford, and the pastures were overgrazed in some areas and underused in others. I called the local veterinarian, Dr. Megan Moore, who drove out to the ranch in a truck that doubled as a mobile clinic. Megan was about my age, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with confident skill as she examined my cattle. She'd grown up on a ranch 20 miles south of Pine Ridge and had come back after veterinary school to serve the local ranching community. Quote, she told me bluntly. Quote 45. The bill for medications and treatments came to $800, money I didn't have. Megan must have seen something in my expression because she offered to set up a payment plan, but I could tell she was taking a risk on someone she barely knew. Dennis was a good man, she said as she packed up her equipment, but he was too proud to ask for help when he needed it. Don't make the same mistake. That night, I sat at Dennis's kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to make numbers work that simply wouldn't. The ranch needed everything: new equipment, building repairs, veterinary care, feed supplements, and probably 100 other things I hadn't thought of yet. The money Dennis had left would cover basic expenses for maybe 6 months if I was extremely careful. I was starting to understand why so many ranchers were selling to developers. The economics were brutal, and I was trying to learn a complex business while running out of money. But every time I considered giving up, I thought about Dennis's letter, about my grandmother Sarah, and about the generations of family who'd built this place with their own hands. The phone rang while I was staring at the bills, and I answered to hear an unfamiliar voice with a smooth, professional tone. I'd been expecting this call since Noah had warned me about Kelly, but hearing his voice still sent a chill down my spine. What kind of opportunity? I'm prepared to offer you $400,000 for your property, cash, closing within 30 days. That's significantly more than the current market value for ranch land in your area. $400,000. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to start any kind of life I wanted anywhere in the world. I could go to college, travel, buy a house in a city where I understood how things worked. Quote 51, I said. Quote 52. After Kelly's call, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the barn and sat on a hay bale, looking up at more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. This was what $400,000 would buy me away from. This connection to something bigger than myself, the sense of belonging to a place and a history. But wanting something and being able to keep it were two different things. The next morning, I drove into town to talk to Eric Miller about my options. His law office felt like a safe harbor, a place where problems might have solutions if you could find the right legal framework. Kelly's offer is generous, Eric admitted when I told him about the phone call. Probably more than you'd get from any other buyer. But, Eric leaned back in his chair, but once Kelly owns that land, it'll never be a ranch again. He'll subdivide it into 5-acre lots, build luxury cabins, and market it as authentic Montana living to people who'll visit twice a year. The cattle will be gone, the open spaces will be fenced off, and the character of this whole valley will change. That's not my responsibility, though, is it? I mean, I didn't ask for this inheritance. I don't owe the community anything. No, Eric said quietly. You don't owe anyone anything. But Dennis Ward thought you might feel differently once you spent some time here. That afternoon, I drove to Martha Long's house, a neat little place on the edge of town with a garden that looked like something from a magazine. She invited me in for coffee and homemade pie, and we sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of Pine Ridge's history. I've been thinking about your grandmother, Martha said, about why she left and never came back. I think she was afraid. Afraid of what? Of being trapped. Sarah was brilliant, and she could see a bigger world beyond these mountains. But she was also scared that if she stayed, even for a visit, she might never leave again. This place has a way of getting into your blood. Martha showed me a photograph from her high school yearbook. My grandmother at 18, beautiful and confident, but with something restless in her eyes. She loved this place, but she loved the idea of freedom more. Maybe she was right to leave. Maybe she wouldn't have been happy here. But Dennis never got over losing her. No, he didn't. And I think that's why he left you the ranch. He was hoping you might find what Sarah was looking for, but here in the place where your family belongs. That evening, I called Noah Morris and asked if I could come over to talk. I found him in his barn, working on a piece of equipment by the light of a single bulb, and I told him about Kelly's offer. Quote 67, Noah said without looking up from his work. Quote side, quote, Noah straightened up and looked at me directly. Quote his words stung, but I could hear that he wasn't trying to be cruel. So you think I should sell? I think you should make a decision based on what you really want, not on what you think you should want. Noah wiped his hands on a rag. If you want to be a rancher, really want it, then there are ways to make it work. But it'll take time, and it'll take help, and it'll take more determination than you probably realize. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was trying to repair a broken gate latch when a truck pulled up, and a woman about 40 years old climbed out. She had graying hair and calloused hands, and she introduced herself as Laura Turner, who owned a ranch about 15 miles east of mine. I heard about Dennis's great-nephew, she said without preamble. Thought I'd come by and see how you're settling in. Laura walked around the property with the eye of someone who'd been ranching her whole life, pointing out problems I hadn't noticed, and suggesting solutions that sounded both practical and expensive. But there was something else in her manner, a kind of careful evaluation that made me think this wasn't a purely social call. She said, as we stood looking at my cattle, quote 78, quote 70. Laura's expression was troubled. I've been ranching for 20 years, took over when my daddy died, but it's getting harder every year. Beef prices are down, feed costs are up, and I'm competing against operations 10 times my size. Are you going to sell? I don't know. Part of me thinks I should. Take the money, move to town, maybe start a business that doesn't depend on weather and cattle prices and 100 other things I can't control. Laura looked at the mountains rising around us. But this land has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded here in 1898. How do you put a price on that? We talked for another hour, and I began to understand that my decision about the ranch wasn't just personal. If I sold to Kelly, it would put pressure on other ranchers to do the same. The character of the entire valley was hanging in the balance, and somehow I'd become a key piece in a puzzle I didn't fully understand. That night, I called Megan Moore and asked if she'd be willing to teach me more about cattle management. She agreed to come out the next weekend, and we spent Saturday morning going through my herd animal by animal. Megan had a way of explaining complex concepts in terms I could understand. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, I began to feel like I might actually be capable of learning what I needed to know. The thing about cattle, Megan said as we watched a calf nurse from its mother, is that they're not just livestock. They're part of an ecosystem that's been developing for thousands of years. Take them away, turn this into vacation homes, and you break something that can't be fixed. But people need places to live, right? And if ranching isn't profitable anymore, maybe it's time for something else. Megan looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Quote 87. She was right. I was looking for reasons to sell, ways to justify taking Kelly's money and walking away from a responsibility I'd never asked for. But every day I spent on the ranch, every conversation with neighbors who'd become friends, made it harder to imagine leaving. Sunday morning, I woke to find Noah Morris sitting on my front porch with 2 cups of coffee and a serious expression. I've been thinking about our conversation, he said, handing me a cup, about you not being ready to ranch on your own. And I might have a solution. My oldest son graduated from college last year with a degree in agricultural business. He's been working for a big operation down in Texas, but he's been thinking about coming home. What if we partnered up? Noah's proposal was more complex than I'd expected. His son Eric would move back to Pine Ridge and essentially manage my ranch while teaching me the business. In exchange, the Morris family would lease half my grazing land for their cattle, providing steady income while I learned the ropes. It was a partnership that could benefit everyone, but it would also mean giving up the independence I'd barely had time to get used to. Noah explained, quote 93. The idea appealed to me, but it also felt like admitting defeat, quote down, quote 95. I spent the next week thinking about Noah's offer and watching the way the ranch changed with the weather and the time of day. Mornings brought mist rising from the pastures and cattle moving slowly toward water. Afternoons were all golden light and long shadows, with hawks circling overhead and the constant sound of wind in the grass. Evenings painted the mountains purple and filled the air with the scent of pine and sage. This place was becoming part of me in a way I'd never experienced before. I'd lived in a dozen different foster homes, 3 group homes, and the reformatory, but I'd never felt like I belonged anywhere. Here, surrounded by land that carried my family's history, I was starting to understand what home might feel like. Lewis Kelly called again, increasing his offer to $450,000 and emphasizing that his patience wasn't unlimited. Quote 96, he said with barely concealed threat. Quote 97. I told him I needed another week to decide, but I was already leaning toward Noah's partnership proposal. The money Kelly offered was tempting, but it would disappear eventually. The land would last forever, and maybe that was worth more than any amount of cash. The decision became clearer when I found Dennis Ward's journals in a trunk in the attic. He'd kept detailed records of ranch operations going back 30 years. But more than that, he'd written about his hopes and fears, his regrets about losing touch with family, and his dreams for the future of the land. One entry, written just 6 months before he died, stopped me cold. Quote 98. Another entry, from just 3 months before his death, mentioned his search for family. Quote 99. Reading Dennis's words, I understood that this inheritance wasn't just about land or money. It was about healing something that had been broken in my family for generations. Dennis had spent his life hoping for family to return, and somehow I'd been given the chance to fulfill that hope. I called Noah Morris and accepted his partnership proposal. The next day, Eric Miller drew up the legal agreements, and I signed papers that would change my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. Eric Morris would arrive from Texas in 2 weeks, and together we tried to bring the Blackwood Ranch back to life. The news spread through Pine Ridge faster than I would have thought possible. Martha Long hugged me at the general store and said Dennis would have been proud. Laura Turner stopped by to congratulate me and mentioned that she'd decided not to sell to Kelly either. Even Megan Moore seemed pleased, though she tried to hide her smile when she told me I'd made the right choice. Lewis Kelly wasn't happy. He called one final time, his smooth professional tone replaced by barely controlled anger. "You're making a mistake, King. That ranch will bankrupt you within 2 years, and when it does, I won't be offering $450,000 anymore." "I guess I'll have to take that chance," I told him, and hung up. Eric Morris arrived on a Tuesday morning with a truck full of belongings and ideas about how to modernize ranch operations. He was 24, tall and lean like his father, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you want to do with your life. "First thing we need to do is get a soil analysis," he said as we walked the property. "Then we'll work on a grazing rotation plan that'll improve the grass and increase our carrying capacity. After that, we'll look at genetics, maybe upgrade the herd with some better breeding stock." Eric's enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. We spent the next month working from dawn to dusk, repairing equipment, fixing buildings, and implementing the systems that would make the ranch profitable again. The work was harder than anything I'd ever done, but it was also more satisfying. There's something about building something with your own hands, about seeing immediate results from your labor, that makes every aching muscle worth it. I was learning not just about ranching, but about myself, about capabilities I'd never known I had. By fall, the ranch was transformed. The cattle were healthy and well-fed. The pastures were recovering from years of poor management. And we'd even made a small profit on our first sale of calves. More importantly, I'd found my place in the Pine Ridge community, accepted not as Dennis Ward's charity case great-nephew, but as a neighbor and fellow rancher. 5 years later, I'm sitting on the same front porch where I first read Dennis Ward's letter, watching my own cattle graze in pastures that are greener and more productive than they've been in decades. The Blackwood Ranch is profitable now, not just surviving but thriving, and Eric and I have expanded our operation to include organic beef production that commands premium prices in the specialty market. The house is no longer the lonely place I first encountered. Linda James, a teacher I met at a community barbecue, moved in 2 years ago, and we're planning a wedding for next spring. The upstairs bedrooms that once echoed with emptiness now ring with the laughter of her 2 young children, who've adopted the ranch as their playground and the cattle as their oversized pets. Lewis Kelly never did find another buyer for Laura Turner's ranch, and the development pressure in our valley has eased as ranchers have found new ways to make their operations profitable. The community that seemed so foreign to me 5 years ago has become the foundation of everything I value most in life. Sometimes I think about the path that brought me here, from the reformatory parking lot where I first read that letter to this porch, where I now watch sunsets paint the mountains every evening. It wasn't the life I would have chosen if someone had asked me at 20 what I wanted, but it's become the life I can't imagine living without. I keep Dennis Ward's letter framed on my desk, along with the photograph of my grandmother Sarah standing in front of this same house 70 years ago. I understand now why she left, and I understand why she never came back. Sometimes the thing you're running from and the thing you're running to are the same thing, and it takes a generation or two to figure out the difference. If you're watching this from somewhere that feels like home, I hope you never take that feeling for granted. And if you're watching from a place where you don't quite belong yet, remember that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you choose to stay. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what home means to you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your place in the world. The ranch that saved me continues to teach me something new every day about the difference between owning something and belonging to it, about the way land can hold the memories of everyone who's ever loved it, and about how sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property, but the chance to become the person you were always meant to be.